was a time when crossing an entire continent felt less like a risk and more like a promise. Families spoke about the West as if it were waiting for them, untouched and generous. A place where land was not just owned but earned through movement, endurance, and belief. The journey became part of that promise. Wagons rolled forward carrying supplies and certainty. Every mile gained seemed to prove that preparation, effort, and timing could make something as vast as a continent manageable. The structure of a wagon train reinforced that illusion. Dozens of families moved together, organized and deliberate, each wagon a small, self-contained world. Tools were packed carefully, food rationed with foresight, animals selected for strength. On paper, it was a system built to survive. Progress was slow but steady, and that steadiness created confidence. When something moves forward every day, even at a crawl, it begins to feel unstoppable. And for long stretches, it was. The early weeks rarely carried signs of failure. Trails were visible, rivers crossable, and the land seemed to cooperate just enough to reward persistence. Children adapted quickly, turning monotony into routine, while adults measured success in distance rather than comfort. Every camp at the end of the day became a small victory, another confirmation that they were doing what they were supposed to do. What made these journeys deceptive was not their difficulty, but their rhythm. Hardship existed, but it was predictable enough to manage. A broken wheel could be repaired. A sick animal could be replaced. Delays were treated as temporary interruptions rather than warnings. The system absorbed problems and continued forward, reinforcing the belief that it could handle anything. But the entire structure depended on something far less stable: timing. Everything about the journey west was built around a narrow window. Leave too early, and the plains would not sustain livestock. Leave too late, and the mountains would close. The margin for error was measured in days. Every decision quietly revolved around a single deadline: reach the mountains before winter. It was not a dramatic warning. It was understood almost casually, one of many conditions. Something to keep in mind, but not something to fear. After all, others had made the trip. The trails existed because they worked. The idea that an entire group could fail did not fit the narrative, because failure on that scale required more than bad luck. It required a chain of small decisions that would not feel dangerous at the time. The wagons were never designed for speed. Heavy and slow, they moved at a pace that could not be rushed without consequences. Push too hard, and animals weakened. Slow down too much, and time slipped away. Every adjustment came with a cost, but those costs were rarely immediate. They accumulated quietly, hidden behind the appearance of progress. And progress was always visible. That was the trap. As long as the wheels turned and distance shrank, it was easy to believe everything was under control. Maps were followed, landmarks passed, and the horizon always offered something new. The idea that the journey itself could turn against them did not match what they experienced day after day. Even when alternative routes were suggested, they were framed as improvements. A better path meant less time, less strain. In a system where timing was everything, saving time felt like the smartest decision. And so decisions were made with confidence, not recklessly, but logically. Each one supported by the belief that the journey could be managed and controlled. What remained unseen was how fragile that control was. Because the environment did not operate on their schedule, seasons did not adjust, terrain did not become easier, and the further west they traveled, the less forgiving it became. The plains allowed for mistakes. The mountains did not. Still, none of that was obvious at the beginning. At the beginning, everything aligned just enough to confirm expectations. Wagons moved, animals endured, people adapted. Even challenges seemed to validate preparation. Every solved problem strengthened the belief that the next one could also be solved. That belief became the foundation of everything that followed. Because once a system convinces you it works, you stop questioning whether it might fail. You trust momentum over caution. The journey west was never just about distance. It was about maintaining that momentum long enough to outrun the one thing that could not be negotiated with. Winter was not an obstacle to overcome. It was a fixed point, moving steadily toward them. But early on, winter felt distant, abstract. As long as the wagons kept moving, there was no reason to believe anything would change. No reason to believe the system would fail. No reason to imagine control was never truly theirs. And for a while, it looked like it would. What would later be remembered as the Donner Party was, at first, a loose collection of families and individuals moving in the same direction. They came from different places, carried different expectations, and held different ideas about what the journey would demand. Some had experience. Others had never gone beyond their own state. But once the wagons gathered, they became something else. A moving community. At its center stood George Donner, a man whose presence carried quiet authority. He was older, a landowner known for steadiness rather than ambition. Leadership, in his case, came from perception. People trusted him because he appeared deliberate, someone who would not make decisions lightly. But George Donner was not the only voice. James Reed stood in contrast. Where Donner was cautious, Reed was decisive. Where Donner weighed options, Reed pushed forward. He carried confidence that bordered on impatience, the kind that could move a group quickly, but divided just as fast. Reed believed in control, in the idea that the right decisions could overcome almost anything. Around them, the group formed a structure more fragile than it appeared. There were families with young children, wagons packed with everything they owned. Hired hands worked in exchange for passage, often without a say in decisions. Some traveled alone, attaching themselves for safety. Altogether, the numbers grew to around 80 or 90 people. It was enough to feel secure, and just enough to become complicated. Because a group that size does not move as a single mind. It moves as a collection of priorities, fears, and expectations. Every decision passed through agreement, persuasion, or resistance. While progress continued, those differences stayed beneath the surface. Daily life kept the structure intact. Mornings began early. Wagons were checked, animals fed, supplies accounted for. Movement defined the day. The pace was steady but never fast, shaped by the slowest animals. Dust settled into everything, becoming part of the experience. Evenings brought another rhythm. Camps were set, fires built, meals prepared from limited supplies. Conversations filled the space between exhaustion and sleep. Distance covered, land ahead, decisions yet to come. For children, it could still feel like an adventure. For adults, it was a measure. At this stage, everything seemed on track. Food held, animals survived. The group remained intact. No disasters. Every sign pointed toward continuation. But beneath that routine, tension had begun to form. It built slowly, through small disagreements. Pacing, when to stop or push forward, how to respond to obstacles. Each decision revealed differences in how the journey should be managed. Donner favored caution, preserve resources, avoid risks. Reed saw time as something to use. Every delay was a threat. Moving faster was necessary. Those perspectives could coexist, but not indefinitely. The first fractures appeared when decisions had to be made quickly. Reed pushed. Donner hesitated, not out of indecision, but responsibility. In those moments, the difference became a dividing line. Others began to take sides. Some trusted Reed's urgency. Others leaned toward Donner's steadiness. Neither side was entirely wrong, because there was no clear proof of which approach would work, only belief. Reed's personality began to stand out more sharply. His confidence started to carry impatience, a willingness to push decisions forward without full agreement. Not just a leader, but a risk. Still, the group moved forward. From the outside, nothing seemed wrong. But internally, something had shifted. The journey was no longer just about reaching the destination. It was about how they would get there. Because survival depended not just on supplies, but on alignment. and that alignment was already weakening. They were not trained explorers. They were families, workers, individuals, ordinary people, believing the system would hold, believing the path would remain manageable, believing one decision would carry them through. The idea of a shortcut did not arrive as a gamble. Lansford Hastings described it as a better route west, one that would save time and carry travelers more directly toward California. His words spread through letters and guidebooks, promising efficiency in a journey where efficiency meant everything. A faster route meant safety. A faster route meant margin. And margin felt like control. By the time the group encountered the option, the decision felt logical. Others had spoken about it. It was presented as an improvement. The main trail was longer. The cutoff offered something better. James Reed supported it. That mattered. Reed saw it as an advantage. It matched his instinct to move faster. Staying on the longer route meant unnecessary delay. George Donner hesitated, but not enough to stop it. And so the decision was made. Through agreement, the wagons turned away from the established trail. The first signs of trouble came as absence. There was no road. Where the cutoff should have guided them, there was only terrain. No path, no signs of prior travel. What had been described as a passage was only a direction, and a direction is not a road. Progress slowed immediately. Without a trail, every mile had to be created. Trees blocked the way, brush tangled around wagons, and the ground resisted movement. The group had to stop constantly to clear space. What had been steady travel became labor. Movement turned into effort measured in hours, not miles. Each day ended with far less distance than expected. Time began to slip. At first, the loss did not feel critical. Delays had happened before. They could be recovered. The group worked harder, but the terrain did not change. Then came the Wasatch Mountains. Difficulty increased. Elevation slowed animals, narrowed paths, and introduced obstacles that could not be easily removed. Wagons had to be maneuvered through spaces never meant for them. Effort multiplied. Progress did not. Strain began to show. Fatigue replaced routine. Tasks required more time than they had. And still, they continued. Turning back was no longer simple. Distance had already been committed. The decision had momentum, and momentum is difficult to break. By the time they cleared the mountains, the damage was done. But worse was ahead. The Great Salt Desert stretched wide and open. No trees, no narrow passes, just distance. But distance, under the wrong conditions, becomes something else. The heat was relentless. No shade, no relief. The ground reflected the sun, draining strength faster than it could be recovered. Water became critical, and the animals began to fail. Oxen collapsed. Horses weakened. Each loss meant movement lost. Wagons had to be abandoned. Supplies left behind, not because they were unimportant, but because they could not be carried. The system began to break apart. Every mile forward came at a cost that could not be recovered. And still, the desert did not end quickly. Days stretched longer than expected. Only forward remained. By the time they emerged, the difference was clear. They had lost time, not days, but weeks. Weeks that had been part of their margin. Gone. The psychological shift followed. Optimism faded, replaced by doubt. Decisions were no longer improvements, but potential mistakes. Had they miscalculated? Could they recover? The tone of conversations changed, and beneath it all, a realization took shape. Time was no longer something they controlled. It was something they had already spent. When they rejoined the main trail, the contrast was immediate. The path was visible again. Movement became easier, but the relief did not fully arrive, because the trail had not changed. They had. They were slower, more strained. The system was no longer intact, and the calendar had continued without them. The window was closing. The mountains ahead were no longer just part of the journey. They were a deadline, and that deadline was close. By the time they rejoined the trail, Winter was no longer far away. The shift did not happen all at once. It came through small pressures that no longer disappeared at the end of the day. Conversations grew shorter, decisions more strained. The journey was no longer something they managed together, but something each endured. Tension surfaced. The loss of time changed everything. Where there had been patience, there was urgency. Where there had been trust, there was doubt. The group still moved forward, but cohesion weakened. Differences became harder to ignore. People questioned decisions and those making them. Skepticism spread. James Reed became more divisive. His confidence now collided with others who no longer trusted it. Certainty without agreement began to feel like imposition. Others resisted. Instructions were questioned. Actions second-guessed. The group was no longer moving with a single intent. And in that environment, it did not take much for conflict to escalate. The breaking point came between James Reed and John Snyder, a teamster responsible for handling wagons and animals. His role placed him directly in the physical execution of decisions. As pressure mounted, that position became difficult. Delays and failures in movement were no longer shared problems. They became personal blame. The argument did not begin as something extraordinary. It started as many disagreements had before, over control, over responsibility, over how the journey should be handled in a moment that did not allow for delay. Voices rose, positions hardened. Neither side stepped back. In a different time, under different conditions, it might have ended there. But this was no longer that group. The strain they carried had already pushed them closer to a point where restraint required more than either man was willing to give. What followed was sudden. Reed, in the escalation of that conflict, used a knife. The act itself was not drawn out, not the result of prolonged struggle, but immediate and irreversible. Snyder was wounded in a way that left no space for recovery. Within a short time, the outcome was clear. John Snyder was dead. The moment did not feel real at first, not because it was unclear what had happened, but because it represented something the group had not yet faced. Up to that point, every problem, no matter how difficult, had existed within the boundaries of the journey. This was different. This was not terrain, not weather, not timing. This was internal, and it could not be undone. The response was immediate, but not unified. There was no shared instinct on how to handle what had just occurred. Some saw it as an unforgivable act, a line crossed that demanded consequence. Others saw it through a different lens, shaped by the conditions they were already struggling under. Stress, exhaustion, pressure, all of it contributing to a moment that might not have happened under different circumstances. But the group could not ignore it. A decision had to be made. James Reed was banished. The punishment was not execution, not imprisonment, but removal. He was forced to leave the group, to continue alone, separated from the structure that had carried him this far. It was a decision that balanced consequence with necessity. Removing him addressed the immediate conflict, but it also avoided creating another. Still, the meaning of that decision went deeper than the act itself. For the first time, survival had overtaken morality as the primary force guiding their actions. The group was no longer operating under the same assumptions that had defined it at the beginning. What mattered now was not just what was right, but what was possible. What could be enforced? What could be sustained? The lines that separated those ideas had begun to blur. Reed's removal did not resolve the tension. It exposed it. Because if one member of the group could be cast out, then the idea of unity was no longer absolute. The structure that had once held them together now had a visible fracture, one that could not be ignored or repaired quickly. Trust, already weakened, took another step back. Leadership suffered as well. George Donner's position, already challenged by earlier disagreements, now carried less authority. Not because he had failed in a single moment, but because the group itself no longer responded as it once had. Decisions required more negotiation, more persuasion, more effort to maintain even partial agreement. The system was still functioning, but not as a whole. Subgroups began to form, not formally, but through alignment of thought and trust. People gravitated toward those they agreed with, those they felt understood the situation in the same way. The idea of a single unified group gave way to something more fragmented, more unstable, and that fragmentation carried forward. The wagons still moved in the same direction. The path ahead had not changed, but the people following it were no longer connected in the same way. Each decision now passed through a fractured structure, one where agreement was harder to reach and easier to break. The journey, once defined by collective movement, had become something else. A collection of individuals moving together, but not as one. From this point on, they were no longer one group. By the time they reached the Sierra Nevada, the journey had already taken more than it had given. The mountains did not appear suddenly. They rose gradually, visible long before they were reached, their presence constant on the horizon. For weeks, they had been the next objective, the final major barrier before California. A challenge, but not an unexpected one. The group had always known this part would come. It had been accounted for, planned around, built into the timing of everything they had done. But they were no longer moving according to that plan. The delay from the cutoff had followed them all the way to the base of the mountains. It was no longer something they could ignore or recover from. Every mile forward now carried the weight of what had already been lost. And as they began the ascent, that weight became impossible to separate from the reality in front of them. The conditions changed quickly. The air grew colder, the terrain steeper, the path narrower. Movement slowed again, not because of obstacles they could remove, but because of limits they could not overcome. Animals struggled against elevation and fatigue. Wagons required more effort to move even short distances. What had once been difficult became exhausting. Still, they continued, because stopping was not an option. At least, not yet. The first snowfall did not feel like a disaster. It came as a warning, light at first, thin enough to settle without immediately blocking the path. It changed the landscape, covered the ground, but did not stop movement. The group adjusted, as they had before, pushing forward with the understanding that this was part of the environment they had expected to encounter. But the snow did not stop. It intensified, building in layers that did not melt, only accumulated. The ground disappeared beneath it. The path became harder to follow, then harder to recognize. Movement slowed again, this time not from effort, but from uncertainty. Each step forward required confirmation, each direction questioned before it was taken. And then, it became impossible. The snowfall deepened to a point where the wagons could no longer move. Wheels sank, animals lost footing, and the terrain itself vanished beneath a surface that offered no stability. What had once been a path forward no longer existed in any practical sense. They tried to push through. At first, with effort, then with desperation. But the result did not change. The wagons were blocked. Completely. There was no clear way forward and no realistic way back. The route behind them had been erased by the same conditions that now trapped them. Even if they attempted to retreat, they would face the same terrain, the same depth, the same impossibility of movement. For the first time, the journey stopped. Not paused, stopped. The realization did not come instantly, but it came quickly enough. Attempts were made, options considered, small efforts to find a way through or around what had formed in front of them. But each attempt led to the same conclusion. They were not passing the mountains. Not like this. The environment around them shifted from obstacle to enclosure. Snow continued to fall, covering everything in a uniform, disorienting layer. Depth increased beyond what could be easily measured, reaching heights that made walking itself difficult, exhausting, sometimes impossible without breaking a path first. Landmarks disappeared. The ground, once something they could read and navigate, became a surface that concealed everything beneath it. Nearby, a lake sat frozen under the same conditions, its surface indistinguishable from the land around it unless you knew where to look. Donner Lake. It did not offer water, not in any usable form, not without effort that would cost more than it returned. It was simply another part of the environment that had turned against them. A frozen expanse that reflected the same reality as everything else. Isolation. There were no other travelers passing through, no movement beyond their own. The trail, once a shared route, had disappeared under the weight of the season. They were alone in a way they had not been at any point in the journey. And with that isolation came a decision. If they could not move, they would have to stay. Shelter became the priority. Cabins were constructed from available materials, crude but necessary, designed not for comfort, but for survival. Wood was gathered, structures assembled in a way that provided at least some protection from the cold that now defined every part of their environment. It was not enough to make the situation stable, but it was enough to make it possible to endure, at least in the short term. The animals, those that remained, were no longer seen as transportation. They were resources. One by one, they were killed, not out of choice, but out of necessity. Meat that had once been reserved, rationed carefully for a journey that was supposed to continue, was now consumed in a context that had changed entirely. There was no longer a next stage to prepare for, only the present, only survival. And with that shift, something else changed. The understanding of their situation became clear. This was not a delay. This was not a temporary obstacle that could be waited out with patience and planning. They were trapped. The realization moved through the group in different ways. Some accepted it quickly, adjusting their thinking to match what was now required. Others resisted it, holding on to the idea that movement would resume, that a path would open, that this was still part of a journey rather than the end of it. But the evidence did not support that belief. Every day the snow remained. Every attempt to move failed. Every resource consumed brought them closer to a reality that could no longer be avoided. They were not continuing west. They were not going back. They were staying exactly where they were. The structure of the group, already weakened, now had to adapt to a completely different purpose. It was no longer about coordination for travel. It was about managing survival in a fixed location with limited resources and no clear timeline for relief. Time, once measured in distance, was now measured in endurance. Days blended together, defined by cold, by hunger, by the constant awareness that nothing outside their immediate environment was changing in their favor. The mountains, which had once been something to cross, had become something that held them in place. And winter, which had once been a deadline they were racing against, was no longer approaching. It was already there, fully, unavoidable, final. Winter had arrived, and they were not going anywhere. At first, the problem did not feel immediate. They still had food. Not enough to feel secure, but enough to maintain the belief that this situation could be endured. The animals they had slaughtered provided meat that was rationed carefully, divided with the same discipline that had carried them across the plains. Meals became smaller, more deliberate, but they still existed. As long as food remained, even in reduced amounts, the situation felt contained, manageable. Days passed in a pattern that no longer involved movement. Instead of preparing wagons, they prepared portions. Instead of measuring distance, they measured what was left. Each decision was no longer about progress, but about preservation. How much to eat, when to eat, how long they could stretch what remained. And at first, those calculations seemed to work. But the problem with rationing is that it only delays the outcome. It does not change it. The supplies began to diminish in ways that could not be ignored. The portions grew smaller. The intervals between meals stretched longer. Hunger, which had once been an occasional discomfort during travel, became constant. It settled into the body, into the mind, reshaping how everything felt and how everything was perceived. The group adapted again. They had to. When the meat from the animals was gone, they turned to what remained behind. Hides that had been preserved for other uses were stripped, cut, and boiled. Leather, once part of harnesses or equipment, was softened and consumed in the same way. Bones were broken down, not for nourishment in the traditional sense, but for anything they might still contain. It was not food, but it was something. And something was enough to continue, at least for a little longer. The process was slow, painfully slow. There was no single moment where everything collapsed. Instead, it stretched out over days and weeks, each one taking more than the last. The body began to weaken, gradually at first, then more noticeably. Tasks that had once been routine became difficult. Standing required effort. Walking became exhausting. Even simple movements carried weight. The change was visible. Faces grew thinner, movements slower, voices quieter. The energy that had once driven conversation and activity disappeared, replaced by a kind of stillness that was not rest, but depletion. And with that depletion came the first deaths. They did not happen all at once. They came one by one. The weakest went first. Children whose bodies could not endure the prolonged hunger. Elderly members whose strength had already been limited. Those who had less to give simply reached their limit sooner. There was no sudden event, no clear moment of transition. They faded, quietly. And once it began, it did not stop. Each death changed the group, not just in number, but in atmosphere. The presence of loss became constant, something that no longer shocked in the same way after the first few times. It was acknowledged, felt, but also absorbed into the reality they were now living in. Because there was no alternative. They could not leave. They could not move on. They could only remain where they were and continue waiting. Waiting became the central experience. Waiting for weather to change. Waiting for a path to open. Waiting for someone, anyone, to arrive with help. The idea of rescue remained, at least for a time. It had to. Without it, there was nothing to anchor hope to. The expectation was not immediate, but it was present. Other groups had made the journey. News would eventually spread. Someone would notice their absence. Someone would come. But days passed without any sign. No tracks. No movement beyond their own. No indication that the outside world was even aware of where they were or what was happening. The waiting stretched longer, and with each passing day, the expectation weakened. The silence around them was not just physical. It became psychological. Conversations diminished, not because there was nothing to say, but because speaking required energy, and energy was no longer something they could spend freely. People spoke less, moved less, reacted less. The group, once defined by interaction and shared effort, became quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Time lost its structure. Without movement, without clear markers of progress, days began to blend together. The only distinction came from loss, from what had changed, from who was no longer there. Memory became anchored to absence rather than action. And through all of it, they watched. They watched others weaken. They watched others stop eating, not because they chose to, but because they no longer could. They watched the process repeat, understanding exactly where it would lead, but unable to stop it. There was no intervention left to offer, no solution that had not already been exhausted. Each person became aware of the same possibility, not as a distant fear, but as an approaching certainty. The body could only endure so much, and they were already beyond what it was meant to endure. The remaining food sources, if they could be called that, began to disappear as well. Hides grew scarce. Leather ran out. Bones, once broken down and boiled repeatedly, offered less and less each time. The process that had extended their survival reached its limit. There was nothing new to turn to, nothing left to stretch. The group, already reduced, continued to shrink. Each loss made the situation more severe for those who remained, not because it changed the amount of food, but because it changed the reality they were facing. There was no longer any illusion of recovery, no belief that things would improve before they reached the same point. They were not moving toward survival. They were moving toward the end of what they could endure. And still, they remained, because there was nowhere else to go. The final stage did not arrive with a clear boundary. It emerged gradually, as everything else had. A point where the last of what could be consumed was gone, where even the smallest sources had been exhausted, where the calculations no longer mattered because there was nothing left to calculate. The waiting continued, but now it was empty. Eventually, there was nothing left to eat. The line was not crossed in a moment of chaos. It was approached slowly, almost carefully, as if recognizing what it meant could delay what had to happen. For days, the reality had been building towards something no one had been willing to say out loud. Hunger had already stripped away comfort, routine, and strength. What remained was not endurance, but decline. And decline, if it continues long enough, forces a decision. At first, the idea was rejected without discussion. Not formally, not as a group, but instinctively. There are limits that exist beyond logic, boundaries that define what is acceptable even in extreme conditions. For most of them, this was one of those boundaries. It did not matter how severe the situation had become. There were lines that were not meant to be crossed. But the situation did not respond to belief. It continued. The deaths, which had already begun, created a new and unavoidable reality. Bodies remained, present in a way that could not be ignored. They were no longer just symbols of loss. They were something else now, something that existed within the same system of survival that had already consumed everything else. The shift did not happen all at once. It began with thought, not action. The recognition that there was no other source left. No animals, no supplies, no materials that could be transformed into something edible. Nothing. And in that absence, the question changed. It was no longer about what was acceptable. It was about what was possible. The first time it happened, it was not done openly. It was done quietly, without announcement, without acknowledgement beyond those directly involved. There was no ceremony, no attempt to redefine it into something easier to accept. It remained what it was, even as it was done. Reluctance defined it. Resistance remained, even as the act took place. There was no sense of normalization, no immediate shift into acceptance. Each person confronted it individually, and each response was different. Some refused entirely, choosing to endure the consequences of that refusal. Others reached a point where refusal was no longer something they could maintain. Because the body does not negotiate indefinitely. It demands. And when it demands long enough, it overrides. The act itself was not driven by desperation in a sudden sense. It was driven by inevitability, a progression that had removed every other option, one step at a time, until this was what remained. Not as a solution, but as a continuation. Survival had replaced morality, not through choice, but through erosion. What had once been unthinkable became unavoidable, and once it began, it did not stop. But even that was not enough to resolve the situation, because eating did not restore strength. It extended it. Barely. It provided just enough to delay what had already begun, not enough to reverse it. The group remained trapped, still without a path forward, still without rescue, still waiting in a condition that had not fundamentally changed. And waiting, at that stage, was no longer sustainable. The idea of leaving began to take shape, not as a collective decision, but as a necessity recognized by a smaller group within them. If no one was coming, then someone had to go. The mountains, despite everything, still represented the only path out. Impossible under the current conditions, but perhaps not entirely. Perhaps. The group that formed would later be known as the Forlorn Hope, a name that fit the reality of what they were attempting. A small number of individuals, reduced already by starvation, weakened, unprepared for the journey ahead in any conventional sense. They would travel on foot, across terrain that had already proven impossible even with wagons and full strength. But staying meant certainty. Leaving offered something else, even if that something was small. They prepared with what little they had: improvised snowshoes, limited provisions, and the understanding that once they left, there would be no return unless they succeeded. The group that remained behind watched them go, knowing exactly what the journey required and what it would take from them. The separation marked another fracture, not just in structure, but in fate. Because from that point on, survival would not be shared equally. The journey of the Forlorn Hope was defined by the same conditions that had already trapped them, but without the limited shelter the cabins had provided. Snow depth that made movement exhausting. Cold that drained energy faster than it could be replaced. Visibility that shifted unpredictably, sometimes reducing the world to nothing more than immediate surroundings. Snow blindness set in quickly. The reflection of light against the snow damaged their eyes, reducing vision, making navigation even more difficult. Movement slowed further. Direction became uncertain. Each step required effort that few of them had left to give, and the food they carried did not last. Starvation returned, faster this time. Without shelter, without reserves, the decline accelerated. Weakness deepened into collapse. Members of the group began to fall behind, unable to continue at the pace required to survive. The same pattern repeated, but now in motion rather than stillness. Deaths began again. But this time, the situation forced a different kind of decision. Waiting for death was no longer viable, because waiting meant losing everyone. The line that had already been crossed once appeared again, but in a different form. Not after death, but before it. The question was no longer just about survival through what remained. It was about whether survival could be taken rather than waited for. It was not approached lightly. There was resistance, discussion, attempts to avoid it, but the conditions did not allow for prolonged hesitation. Each day reduced their chances. Each delay brought them closer to the same outcome they had left behind. The decision, when it came, was not framed as choice. It was framed as necessity. Those who could continue had to. Those who could not became part of what allowed that continuation. It was not sudden, not chaotic, but controlled in a way that reflected the reality they were operating within. Survival had become the only measure left, and every action was filtered through it. Some refused, some participated. All were changed by it. The group diminished, but it continued moving, step by step, through terrain that did not ease, through conditions that did not improve, through a process that stripped away everything except the most basic instinct to keep going. And eventually, for some of them, it worked. They reached the other side. Not all at once, not together, but enough to carry the information forward. Enough to reach settlements, to communicate what had happened, to trigger the response that had been absent for so long. Rescue, when it finally came, did not arrive as a solution. It arrived as a reaction. Teams were organized, sent back into the mountains, tasked with retrieving those who remained. But even then, the process was slow, complicated by the same conditions that had created the situation in the first place. Not everyone could be reached at once. Not everyone could be saved. Time, which had already taken so much, continued to take more. By the time the final groups were brought out, the number of survivors had been reduced significantly. The names that remained did not match the number that had started the journey. The system that had once carried them across the plains no longer existed in any recognizable form. What remained were individuals, some alive, many not. The line they had crossed could not be uncrossed. The decisions made could not be separated from the conditions that had created them. Survival had come at a cost that did not end when they left the mountains. It stayed, in memory, in silence, in the understanding of what had been required. Because in the end, it had never been about choice. It had been about what was left when there was no choice. Some made it out. Most didn't. Rescue did not arrive all at once. It came in waves, each one smaller than what was needed, each one forced to operate within the same conditions that had already trapped the group for months. The first rescuers did not find a single unified camp. They found fragments, small clusters of survivors spread across the area, some still in makeshift cabins, others barely holding on in conditions that had already taken everything from them. The journey back was not simple. Even for those who had come prepared, the mountains did not become easier. Snow still blocked paths, cold still drained strength, and distance still demanded more than most could give. The rescuers could not carry everyone at once. They did not have the resources, the animals, or the time. So they had to choose. Who was strong enough to move? Who could survive the journey out? Who had to be left behind, at least for now? The decisions were not made with certainty. They were made with estimation, with judgment under pressure, with the understanding that every choice would have consequences. Some were selected because they could walk, others because they were too weak to last until the next rescue attempt. There was no perfect logic, no outcome that did not involve loss. Each group taken out reduced the number left behind, but it also reduced the time those remaining had. The process repeated. Rescue teams came and went, navigating the same terrain, facing the same limitations, carrying as many as they could before turning back. Each return brought relief, but also confirmation of what had already happened. The number of survivors was shrinking. The condition of those still there was worsening. By the time the final rescue parties reached the last groups, there was little left to save. The survivors who emerged were not the same people who had entered the mountains. Physically, the damage was immediate and visible. Bodies weakened by prolonged starvation, unable to recover quickly, some unable to recover at all. Movement was difficult. Illness followed easily. The journey out did not end their struggle. It only changed its form. But the physical damage was only part of it. What remained with them could not be seen as clearly. The experience had altered something deeper, not just memory, but perception, the way they understood themselves, the decisions they had made, the things they had witnessed. Survival had required actions that did not fit into the world they had left behind, and returning to that world did not erase those actions. It carried them forward. In total, fewer than 50 people survived. Out of a group that had once numbered close to 90, the reduction was not just significant, it was defining. The journey that had begun as a collective movement ended as a series of individual outcomes, each shaped by circumstance, timing, and decisions that had often been made under conditions no one was prepared for. The aftermath did not unfold quietly. News of what had happened spread quickly, but not always accurately. The details, fragmented and incomplete, were interpreted, repeated, and reshaped as they moved outward. What reached the public was not the full context of the journey, but the most extreme parts of it. Cannibalism became the central narrative. It overshadowed everything else. The months of travel, the decisions about routes, the delays, the snowfall, the isolation, all of it compressed into a single aspect that was easier to focus on, easier to judge. The complexity of what had happened did not translate into public understanding. It became something simpler, something darker. And for the survivors, that simplification created a new kind of burden. They had not only endured the experience itself, but now had to exist within how it was perceived by others. Judgment came quickly, often without consideration for the conditions that had led to those decisions. The line they had crossed was seen as absolute, without the context that had made it inevitable. Some tried to explain, others did not. Silence became the more common response, because there are experiences that do not translate well into explanation. Not because they cannot be described, but because description does not change how they are received. Words cannot fully carry the conditions, the progression, the absence of alternatives that define moments like those. And so many chose not to try. They rebuilt their lives in quieter ways, away from the focus of what had happened, away from the need to justify or defend decisions that had been made when there were no acceptable options left. The memory remained, but it was not something they shared freely. It stayed internal, contained. For those who had not been there, the story became something else entirely. A cautionary tale, a symbol of failure, of miscalculation, of what happens when a journey goes wrong. The focus shifted toward the decision to take the cutoff, toward the conflict within the group, toward the final stages of survival that captured attention in ways the earlier parts did not. But those interpretations, while not entirely wrong, were incomplete, because what happened in the Sierra Nevada was not the result of a single mistake. It was the result of accumulation, small decisions, delays, conditions that aligned in ways that removed options one by one, until there were none left. The Donner Party did not begin as something extreme. It became extreme, and that transformation is what defines it. Not just the outcome, but the process. The gradual shift from control to loss of control, from structure to collapse, from choice to necessity. The story, in the end, is not only about what people did to survive. It is about how long they held on before they had to, and how far a system can be pushed before it breaks completely. Because for a long time, everything looked like it would work. The wagons moved, the group held together, the decisions made sense, until they didn't. Until the margin disappeared, until the environment stopped allowing recovery, until survival itself required something that had never been part of the plan. And by then, there was no way back, only forward through whatever remained. And for those who lived, that forward path did not end in the mountains. It followed them the rest of their lives.